From about 1900 to the present day, New York was run by the Mafia, and this is how they did it. As we'll see in this video, the Mafia controlled every aspect of life for the city's millions of people. They ran gambling, prostitution, and almost every single business that you can think of. The five families of La Cosa Nostra had forged an uneasy alliance, working together to ensure their survival and prosperity. So what made the Mafia takeover possible? First of all, there was no police force in New York or any other American city. And so if you wanted to commit a crime, you could get away with it unless you were unlucky enough to be caught by one of the many vigilant neighborhood watch groups. As well as not having a police force, there was also no federal law enforcement agency like the FBI either. This meant that most crimes went unpunished and criminals operated freely. In fact, in the early 20th century, gangs would even settle their differences through fistfights in public. The other thing that allowed the Mafia to thrive was the sheer number of immigrants that were pouring into the country at the time. Most of these immigrants were Italian, and many of them were desperate for work and easy money. It just so happened that the Mafia had plenty of both, and so most of the Italian immigrants soon found themselves indebted to the Mafia. In fact, at one point, there was an estimated 60,000 gangsters in New York alone. But how exactly did the Mafia control everything? Well, it all started when a group of Italian gangsters arrived from the south of Italy. These guys had previously worked as soldiers under the rule of the feared crime boss, Tito. But when Tito was killed by rival mobsters, these men were forced to flee to the United States to escape the wrath of his successors. And so that SYULL often hear the term Cosa Nostra used to refer to the Mafia. Cosa Nostra means our thing, or our business in Italian. And it was originally used as the name for the group of soldiers who worked directly under Tito. Once they arrived in New York, they quickly adapted to their new surroundings and adopted the customs and culture of the local Irish and Jewish gangs. They began working as thugs for hire and quickly established themselves as a criminal force to be reckoned with. Eventually, they expanded their criminal activities to include extortion, bootlegging, and prostitution, which made them extremely wealthy. And in fact, they became so powerful that the authorities had to start taking them seriously. In the early days, the Mafia tried to avoid violence with the authorities, but eventually the police started targeting them, so they had no choice but to fight back. This led to a violent turf war between the police and the Mafia that lasted for years. But eventually the Mafia won out, and they were able to control the entire city. Now, although the Mafia were able to control the police force and other aspects of the city, there was one thing that they couldn't control, and that was the media. And this nearly caused the downfall of the entire organization. See, the Mafia had managed to bribe pretty much every newspaper editor in the city. But there was one man who refused to accept their bribes. His name was Charles Pokey, and he published the truth about the Mafia in his weekly newspaper, which was called Variety. Of course, this didn't go down too well with the Mafia, and they threatened Pokey's life several times. But he refused to back down. Eventually, the Mafia decided that they had no choice but to silence him. So on April 18th, 1927, two gunmen approached Pokey while he was walking home from his office and shot him dead in front of hundreds of people. This event shocked the city, and it led to a major crackdown on the Mafia. However, Mafia were still a powerful force in the city, and it would be decades before they were finally brought down. That being said, after this event, the Mafia decided to focus more on working behind the scenes rather than being out in the open. And that's why we know so little about them today. So how did the Mafia control New York? Well, the first thing that they did was to form alliances with other criminal groups in the city. This included the Irish and Jewish gangs, as well as other Italian gangs. By forming these alliances, the Mafia was able to expand its power base and resources. They were then able to use this power to control the city's economy. One way that they did this was through extortion. The Mafia would target businesses and individuals and threaten them unless they paid a certain amount of money. They would often demand money in exchange for protection, but they would also extort people for other reasons as well. For example, they might demand money from a business owner in order to allow them to operate, or they might extort someone who owed money to a mobster. Another way that the Mafia controlled the city was through gambling and prostitution. These were two highly profitable activities that were illegal at the time, and the Mafia was able to capitalize on this by providing gambling opportunities and running brothels. They were also able to use these activities to further their other criminal enterprises. For example, They might use a gambling den as a front for a loan sharking operation. Of course, none of this would have been possible without the help of corrupt officials. The Mafia was able to bribe police officers and politicians in order to protect their illegal activities. This allowed them to operate freely and expand their criminal empire. One of the most famous examples of police corruption during the Mafia's heyday was the relationship between the police and the Lucchese crime family. The Lucchese crime family was one of the 5 major Mafia families in New York, and it was headed by Charlie Lucky Luciano. Luciano had a close relationship with police Commissioner Edward J. Leary, and this allowed the family to operate with relative impunity. In fact, the family was able to bribe the police to the tune of $1 million per year. This level of corruption was unheard of, and it really gave the Mafia a significant advantage over the police. Another way that the Mafia controlled New York was through violence. They weren't afraid to use force to achieve their goals, and this often involved murder. They would often target people who were involved in their criminal activities, such as informants or people who owed them money. But they would also use violence against anyone who threatened their power base. For example, they might kill a business owner who refused to pay protection money or a journalist who was investigating their activities. Despite all of this, there were still some people who tried to stand up to the Mafia. These were often ordinary citizens who had had enough of the Mafia's reign of terror. They might have been motivated by a desire for justice or simply a hatred of the Mafia. Whatever their motivations, these people were often targeted by the Mafia, and their lives were often in danger. In the end, the Mafia's reign of terror came to an end. When the authorities finally cracked down on them, this was a long and difficult process, but eventually the Mafia was broken, and New York was finally free of their clutches. Now, even though the Mafia no longer controls New York, their influence is still felt today. Many people still live in fear of the Mafia and their activities, and there are still many secrets that the Mafia is hiding. If you want to learn more about the Mafia, then make sure to stay tuned. We've got plenty more videos where we explore the dark underbelly of society. Now, before we finish, I want to say thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe to stay up to date on our latest content. And if you're feeling extra generous, you can also check us out on other platforms where we share exclusive content that you won't find anywhere else. Again, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.